Well, hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be able to share with you this morning. Pastor Dave is taking the weekend off. He and Liz experienced a conference this weekend, and so I get the privilege of teaching from our main stage this weekend. It's always a blessing to be able to do that. I got to be honest with you, though, I am experiencing some grief today, and really it's been for several weeks now. Because football season's over. And I know there's March Madness and baseball and NBA playoff and all that. I know. But still, football's my first sports love. And so I did hear in a bit of sports news this week that a name that you might be familiar with, Vince Young, has signed a contract to play for Saskatchewan in the Canadian Football League. And so I know that some folks around here kind of spit on the ground when they hear the name Vince Young said. But I will always know Vince from his days at Texas, and particularly the 2006 Rose Bowl, 4th down and 6 from the 8-yard line, and he scores on an amazing run, and much to Pastor David's sadness, beat the USC Trojans in the national championship game that year. And so when I think about Vince, I will always remember him for that. Now, will he succeed in the CFL? I hope so. I kind of doubt it. Just because, he's 36. He's been out of the game for a long time. But I will always love Vince Young because of his days at Texas. And however, it is something that we like to do in our culture when there's an athlete or a politician or some public figure who is celebrated and who the public has a lot of hope in them, and then they falter, and then we just kick them while they're down. And, we love to do that in public life. It's just sort of the thing that folks do. And sometimes that kind of mentality, believe it or not, can bleed over into the spiritual life. I've seen it happen with people who sort of disavow the faith. They disavow their Christian faith, or they distance themselves from it, or they bag the whole thing because growing up they had a religion or they had an understanding of Christianity that, in a sense, objectified Jesus or turned Jesus into a symbol or an object that is to be known about, who will bring you good fortune if you perform well at it. And even if your life isn't filled with wealth and prosperity, even if your life is filled with struggle, that Jesus will be with you in it. And Jesus will be right there encouraging you along the way. And the promise is that somehow there's going to be some inner peace that occurs because of one's relationship to Jesus. And then people hit doubt and they hit struggle. And they have things happen in their lives that cause them to take a step back and say, wait a minute, I was told that if I gave my life to Jesus, and if I entered into religious ritual, if I did all of the things I was supposed to do and checked off all of the check boxes, that everything would be well with me. And yes, there'll be difficulties in life and there'll be struggles in life. But what we can always count on is that God will be with me and God will come behind me. But then we experience loneliness and feelings of abandonment during those times spiritually. And that really is less a function of Jesus not doing Jesus' job, and it's more a function of the way some teachers and pastors within Christianity set Jesus up as this ideal to give your life to. And then the relational aspects of one's faith sort of go by the wayside. In the past few weeks, we've been in this series that focuses on that relational aspect of faith. In fact, faith is nothing if not relational. It's nothing if not relational. And it's not simply a relationship with an institution or a relationship with a set of beliefs or a relationship with a book or a relationship with some distant mediator. It is actually a very personal, one-on-one relationship that also finds its meaning within community. But once the relationship ceases to be personal, or once it is entered into without the understanding of relationality, then it begins to fall apart, especially when we get tested. I love the Gospel of Mark. There are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Mark is probably the one written first. And it is also the one where I feel most in touch with the human being, Jesus Christ, as opposed to the divine figure of Jesus as God. In my tradition growing up, it was always, Jesus' divinity was always emphasized. In fact, looking back, Jesus was more like kind of a superhero who always knew what was going to happen, who always had a quick answer and a clever response to everything, who always seemed to be one step ahead of everybody, and who could do things like heal people and raise the dead and things of that nature, which he clearly did. But to understand Jesus in his fullness, we must engage with Jesus' humanity. Because it is in his humanness that Jesus engages not only with his own disciples and the people that he lived and worked aside or along with, but he also engages with us throughout time. What that means is that faith, the kind of faith that is personal and the kind of faith that Scripture envisions, and doubt, I don't know of another kind of doubt than personal. But faith and doubt are in fact mutually inclusive. That if you say, I have never had a doubt about my faith, I will say, man, I need to figure out what what kind of faith that you are practicing. Because relationships will always produce doubt and will always produce questions of, is this person really going to be there for me? Am I really going to be able to be there for this person? If you're married, think about your marriage. You have wonderful days where everything's great, and you would so do it all again. I celebrate my 24th anniversary tomorrow, which Veronica and I were so, you can clap, very excited about that. My parents have been married for 63 years, so we have a little catching out to do. But marriage is a way that we can think about this, the relationality of our relationship with God and Jesus. In the sense that there's faith, there's belief, there's trust, but that is almost a daily renewal. And when we're in relationship with our children, the same thing happens. Parenting is one of the most, I think it's probably the most wonderful thing that I've experienced in my life up till now, but it can also be one of the most self-defeating and miserable experiences too. Because at least for me, every time I have a bad encounter with Wyatt, I feel like he's going to be in counseling the rest of his life. And I'm going to be the subject of some book one day that somebody writes. Because that's whenever we invest in a relationship, that's what happens. So I think all of us have experienced doubt and fear in marriages and in love relationships and in parenting and in friendships and even in professional working relationships. And so the idea that somehow that doubt is suspended in the relationship that we have with God is interesting to me and doesn't make sense, especially when we claim it's a personal relationship. And Scripture gives us lots of beautiful pictures of how these relationships interact and all of their messiness. In Mark, I think I mentioned earlier, my favorite gospel. We're going to read from Mark chapter 9 this morning on one of the really neat experiences that the three of the disciples got to share together. Before we read it, I want to set it up a little bit. So Mark begins with Jesus' baptism. And whereas Matthew and Luke began with birth narratives, and John begins with, in the beginning there was the Word. So John goes way back. Mark begins with baptism, with Jesus' baptism. And then Jesus gets on a boat, and he gets into a storm, and he commands the waves to calm. And then he gets on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a guy that's possessed with a demon, and he casts the demons out. And then later he experiences, he encounters a woman who needs to be healed, and he encounters a whole bunch of people who are hungry and need lunch. So he feeds them all. As we all are familiar, hopefully, if you've encountered that story, you remember it, the famous feed the 5,000. So all that stuff is happening leading up to Mark 9. Right before we get to this story, we encounter a glitch from the disciples' perspective and what they thought they'd signed on for. When Jesus says to them, listen, guys, I got to be upfront with you. I am going to suffer and I am going to die. That is where this story is leading. And the disciples are like, wait, that's not what I remember signing up for. Peter, in fact, goes as far to say, over my dead body. Nobody's going to touch you. And if that's when Jesus says, he says, get thee behind me, Satan. If you remember the encounter where Jesus looks at Peter and says, listen, you're evaluating this from the perspective of a human, of a man. This is God's thing for me. So you're trying to derail the mission, and that isn't going to happen. That's what happened right before we encounter this. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, and they led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. You know what? Sorry, that was my insert. Let us make 3 dwellings. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Yeah, he said something anyway. That's the story of my life. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. I want us to notice the relationality found in the text that we just read. Jesus is establishing something in this experience with the apostles, and that is that he's different. His humanity makes them just like they are, but he's different in the sense that his Father, that God has set him aside for something incredibly, cosmically important. And that something happened during Jesus' life on earth where heaven, God, sort of interjected into time and became humankind, became a person, and experienced all the wonder and all of the struggle that humanity experienced. And so they're sort of beginning to see Jesus in that light. But that's kind of what they thought they were signing on to in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, was a political kind of rebellion. Messianic movements during this time were actually relatively common. Jesus was not the only person whom people were making claims about being the Messiah. And so it wasn't like, they didn't have options. But Jesus went to them specifically and called them, and they thought what they were hearing was that Jesus was going to kick the Romans out, and he was going to establish an earthly rule, and the kingdom of God was going to be a literal government under which people would live under the benevolent rule of Jesus as king. And as we see in parts of the gospel, they begin to compete for who's going to be the vice president, who's going to be the secretary of state, etc. And so for them to hear about Jesus, dying, that was a total brain warp. Now, all of that is kind of abstract, like we're hearing about a story. But when you consider these guys walking up the mountain with Jesus, and you get Peter's response, man, why don't we just stay up here? Why don't we just stay up here? Because it sounds like things might get hard down the mountain. So I just want to stay up here where the experience is, the writer says it was terrifying, and yet we find that Peter wants to stay. Now, what's happening on the mountain? Jesus is in conversation with Moses and Elijah, two Old Testament figures. God is in conversation with the disciples, Peter, James, and John, about Jesus. And then the disciples, they're trying to engage one another in conversation. Do you see the relational dynamics that are happening here? These are conversations that people are having with one another within the context of a cosmic event that must have been mind-blowing. Often we want every step of our spiritual journey. I can't speak for you, I'll speak for me. I really need these cosmic events to happen to me on a personal level. Otherwise, over time, the doubts begin to create questions. And I wonder, is Jesus still with me? Is God still with me? Am I doing this right? Maybe I'm making a mistake in the way that I'm living out my faith. Maybe I'm not going to the right Bible study, or maybe I'm not going to the right small group, or maybe I'm not going to the right church, or maybe my belief system needs to be tweaked. Just the right church was metaphorical, by the way. Maybe some things need to be tweaked. In other words, why isn't it working? And that's when we can experience doubt. Even though we've seen God do incredible things in our lives. Even though, just like the disciples experienced all these miracles and they saw Jesus do these things, they're like, wow. I go, if I would have been there and seen all that, man, there's no way I'd ever doubt. But the disciples' experience tell a different story. Our faith is nothing if not relational. Our faith is nothing if not personal. And a personal, relational kind of faith, by definition, will encounter doubt. Not doubt about whether this proposition is true, not doubt as to whether this thing is historical, or is it. Those are not the kinds of doubts that threaten the kind of faith I'm talking about, that is deeply personal. The kind of doubt I'm talking about is the kind of doubt that says, I don't really deserve this. I'm not really worthy of this kind of relationship. Or I misunderstood how this was going to go. Which in essence is what happens to Peter. And so what we're looking for, not only relationality, but we're looking for a quality and maybe even a frequency of experiences that, we kind of walk into church on Sunday, or maybe we listen to some kind of content on the radio or whatever. And what we're looking for is we're looking for an experience that transcends our humanness in a way. We're looking for that experience that we want to go to the marriage weekend and then the marriage is fixed. Or we want our business to grow, so we pick up the number one best-selling business book and we read it. And it's like, I want this to fix it. Or we go to the parenting book and it's like, this is the newest and best resource for parents. And we read it and we go, now I'm going to be an awesome parent. And that lasts like 10 seconds. But if we believe, and I think we do, I think we've established the personal nature of a spiritual relationship, the relationality of it, then we have to take all of the gifts and the blessings that come with a relationship, and we have to take also all the realities that can come with it too, that can make it challenging. And one of those is doubt. And so I would imagine that there may be some of you in here who have experienced doubt in your spiritual life. Maybe your doubt has been, based on, well, did that really happen? Or is that historical, or is it? And those kinds of things can create doubt. And I'm not trying to minimize that doubt at all. It's real. But the kind of doubt that happens in relationship is the kind of doubt that invites us into something. It's the thing that gets us to make that, what Soren Kierkegaard, the Dutch philosopher and sort of theologian during the 19th century, called the leap of faith. And then, of course, the great philosopher and artist Lionel Cartwright at the end of the 20th century did a song called Leap of Faith and, gave Kierkegaard a little help. But the reason it is called a leap of faith is because there are no guarantees of a particular outcome. That's hard. When we get married, we hope it's forever. It may not be. When we have children, we hope they grow up to be doctors and lawyers and whatever, but they may not be. They may not. Anytime we say yes to a relationship, we're also saying yes to uncertainty, to doubt, and to the reality of surrendering control over others' choices. And the same is true in the spiritual relationship. So when they come down from the mountain, we begin to see what happens in the practice of presence in relationship. If somebody were to say, what are some of the important things about, human relationships with spouse, friends, whatever, I would say that practicing presence is one of the most important things. Being together, being authentic with each other, checking in on a regular basis, that's important. And it becomes difficult when the relationship gets strained, or when our schedules don't match up, or life just happens. And so we don't connect. My wife will let me know. And I sense it too in my own heart. It's like we're not connecting. And over 24 years of marriage, that has happened. And doubts occur as a result, and questions occur as a result. But we don't pack it in. No, those doubts are an invitation actually to come together and to deepen our relationship. They get to the bottom of the mountain after having a discussion about Elijah and Moses and some other stuff. And then they encounter a guy whose child is profoundly disabled. Scriptures describe it as a demon possession. This child is, the demon throws the child into the fire and does all kinds of terrible things. And here's this father approaching Jesus with his child and makes a request. And we can read it together. It's 22 to 24. So this is the guy describing now to Jesus what happens. It, the evil spirit, has often cast him into the fire, into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, have pity on us and help us. If you are able to do anything, that's probably how I come to Jesus. Jesus, if you can do anything, please. And then Jesus said to him, if you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out, I believe. And then this next statement is one that I put on t-shirts, put it over my put on my mirror, put it in my office. Help my unbelief. I can't tell you how many times in my spiritual life that has been my prayer. Help my unbelief. I believe that I want to believe. I really do. Help my unbelief. I want to believe what? That in the Trinitarian formula for the Godhead? Or I want to believe in what? That Jesus was equal parts human and divine? And I want to believe what? That, the boat was in a storm and he calmed the storm? And what is it that I'm having trouble believing? Are those things critically important to the equation for that man in that moment? No. This is my child. This is my life. Please, if you can do anything, please have pity on us. I believe. Please help my unbelief. Even as a pastor, folks, there have been days when I won't even pray. I won't dare pray weeks at a time. And it's me disconnecting. It's me backing away because I'm hung up on something. Or maybe I don't feel worthy of being in God's presence. Or maybe I just haven't had time. But doubt always invites me back into relationship. I always end up back going, I'm barely hanging on, God. And I can do that precisely because I am in a personal relationality with Jesus, with divinity, and that invites me into that conversation. Belief, doctrine, all of that stuff has its function in spiritual life. But nothing speaks louder than a parent carrying their child saying, please help me. I don't know if I think it was clear that dad had real misgivings as to whether or not Jesus could actually do anything for the child. We know in Hebrew culture that he probably tried many things before then. Nothing worked. This is probably his last resort. But he remained in relationship with his faith. He remained in relationship with his Jewish beliefs. When everything in him told him to give up, he said, no, I'm going to give it another shot. That's what relationship does. When we feel like we want to give up on the people in our lives, no, love gets us back, right? 1 John is as clear as anything could be clear on the nature of God being love. 1 John doesn't say God is like love or God has love or God does love. It says God is love. That means that love is also God. And Paul, writing to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians, gives us this beautiful picture of what love is, right? If you've been to a Christian wedding, I'd be surprised if this wasn't one of the passages read. It says, love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. And then love endures all things. Love never fails. And that is the disposition that your Creator, that our God in heaven has toward us, embodied in the person of Jesus. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, but is willing to endure all things because it doesn't fail. Now, would the disciples fail? Absolutely. I would say that if we could go back and interview some of the disciples, I bet Thaddeus would say, man, I'm mad because Jesus didn't take me up there on the mountain. Why does Peter, James, and John get all the credit? I bet you some of the disciples would say they were disappointed in Jesus. They probably wished for a different outcome. Maybe Jesus at times was disappointed in them. Maybe the disciples, maybe Peter had some expectations that didn't get met. Maybe Jesus had some expectations that didn't get met. The point is that that's what happens in relationships. But love bears all things. And it believes all things. And it hopes all things. And it endures all things. And so even though these disciples remained in relationship with Jesus, even in spite of their doubt, they kept coming back and they kept following. I was taught growing up that the more time you spent with God and the closer you were with God, the more mature you became and the more, the easier it got. I have found it to be quite the opposite in my own life. There was an old hymn we used to sing, every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. If you're over 40 or over 50 maybe, you might remember that hymn. Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. Every day he whispers, I love you more and more. Jesus saved and keeps me, and he's the one I'm living for. Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. What? That is not my experience. In John 20, after Jesus has been crucified, and now he's in his resurrection appearances, after he's resurrected from the grave, he encounters one of his followers, one of the 12 men on the planet who he was closest to, a guy named Thomas. And Thomas has already said, as people are saying, Jesus says, I just saw him. He's walking around. I saw him down at Walmart or whatever. And Thomas goes, I'm not believing it until I actually can see it with my own eyes. And I have to actually put my hands in his wounds before I believe that's true. You remember that story? John 20. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. Thomas answered, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? I'd be like, yeah. He said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Blessed are those who, even though they don't see me, even though I'm not with them in body, have relationship with me. Thomas needs to put his hands in the wounds. Peter denies Jesus 3 times as he's being arrested and tried and prepared for the crucifixion. It didn't get easier for these guys. Relationality, experience. But they chose to stay present. Even when all looked lost. Even when it's just like, well, I guess he did tell us he had to die. Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? They stayed present. We don't know much about what they believed, but we do know about who they loved. They loved each other, and they remained committed to Jesus. In spite of their doubts, in spite of some really wonderful experiences like the Mount of Transfiguration that we read about earlier, and some really terrible experiences like the crucifixion. Remember in Gethsemane when Jesus is praying to God, to his Father, and saying, do I really have to experience this? I'll do it. And then Jesus is hanging on the cross. He says, why have you forsaken me? Even the relationship between two members of the Godhead, even that relationship was not immune to feelings of abandonment. So if you're feeling abandoned by God this morning, if you're feeling distant, if you're wondering if all this stuff is true, then follow the example of the man who brings his boy and just says, I really want to believe, but you're going to have to help me with my unbelief. You're going to have to fill in the gap for me, because I'm just not sure. Folks, Jesus is not a superhero. Jesus is beyond comprehension. I can't give you language for what his divinity means, but I can tell you this. I know what his humanity means. And I've been invited every day of my life to be in relationship with Jesus. And even on days I say no, love endures all things. It bears all things. Love never fails. Belief can fail. Understanding can fail. Other stuff can get cloudy. Our relationship with each other can have difficulty. But God, who is love, never fails. Vince Young's probably going to fail. I hope not. I hope not. But he'll always be the quarterback for the Longhorns that beat USC. Sorry, David. God, thank you for the fact that you love us. To suggest without condition, I think, is to far understate it. Thank you that the mountaintop experiences are so powerful. But thank you that when we get off of the mountaintops and we walk through the valleys of our lives, that you continually say, I'm with you. I'm with you. And you remain in relationship. God, may I always see doubt as an invitation into something deep, powerful, and transforming. Amen and amen. Thank you for being here. We will see you next week. Go play in the snow, or is it all gone? Oh well. Bye, folks.